Today's read aloud about the westward expansion is called Working on the Transcontinental Railroad. Although many people were thrilled that the Erie Canal enabled people and goods to move westward faster, others were not. For example, the people of Baltimore, Maryland were afraid that people and goods would no longer come through their city. They decided to build a railroad that would connect Baltimore to the Ohio River and the West. They also realized that the power of horses would not be fast enough to compete with other means of transportation, or strong enough to travel long distances through the mountains. Just as Fulton had used a steam engine to power his boat, Peter Cooper of New York designed a locomotive powered by a steam engine. The locomotive is the machine at the front of the train that pulls all of the other cars along the track. Before the locomotive was invented, several horses pulled a car or wagon along the rails, but the locomotive had the power of many horses in a single machine. That's why some people gave it the nickname Iron Horse, because the locomotive was made of a type of metal called iron, and it had the power of many horses to pull the train cars. How did the locomotive work? Well, at the heart of the locomotive was the steam engine. The locomotive's steam engine was similar to the steam engine used in Fulton's steamboat. A coal or wood-burning furnace produced steam, which powered the locomotive. Let's take a look at some vocabulary words in our read aloud today. The first word is ancestor. A person who lived a long time ago from whom another is directly descended, a forefather. The next word is convenient. Suitable for your needs, causing the least difficulty. And the last word is spanned. Covered the length of something from one end to the other. While trains had carried passengers and goods along the East Coast for a number of years, people wanting to travel or send news to the West Coast used the Oregon Trail, steamboats, or the Pony Express. Listen carefully to determine the main topic of the read aloud and to learn whether train tracks were eventually built all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. Let's begin. My name is Michael, and this is a photo of my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ling Wei. He helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. That's a pretty long word, but it's easy to understand if you split it into two parts. The first part of the word is trans, which means across, and the second part is the word continental. So my ancestor Ling Wei helped build a part of the railroad that goes across the continental United States, or from the East Coast to the West Coast. Ling Wei began working on the railroad in 1863. By that time, there were many railroads in the United States, but they mostly went from the northeast to the southeast, or from eastern cities like Baltimore to cities in the Midwest like Omaha, Nebraska. It was cheaper, more comfortable, and more convenient for people to travel by rail than to travel by canal or wagon. It was faster too. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, people could only travel to the west by wagon or horse, or by boat on a river or canal. And the going was slow. Because the iron horse was faster, cheaper, more comfortable, and more convenient, many people thought it would be a great idea to have a railroad track that spanned the entire United States. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ling Wei, helped to lay those tracks that connected settlers in the Midwest near the Missouri River to settlers in Sacramento, California, all the way to the West Coast. How many people can say that about one of their ancestors? It took two separate rail companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad Company started building from Omaha, Nebraska, and laid its tracks going west. The Central Pacific Railroad Company started building from San Francisco, California, and laid its tracks going east. At first, the two companies were competing against each other to see who could lay the most track. The U.S. government paid each company for every mile of track it laid, and both companies wanted to make lots of money. In the end, the government told them that they had to work together and join their tracks. Most of the laborers who laid the track for the Union Pacific Railroad were Irish immigrants. My ancestor, Ling Wei, worked for the Central Pacific Railroad. Like many other Chinese immigrants during the 1800s, Ling Wei had settled in California. He and other Chinese immigrants, as well as other immigrants from all over the world, came to the United States because of the promise of gold and a better life. When people realized that the mountains of gold they had heard about were a myth, they had to find some other way to survive. So many Chinese immigrants worked on the western portion of the railroad, while Irish immigrants worked on the eastern section. These workers laid tracks through the mountains and across rivers and deserts in the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad took 6 years to build, and my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Ling Wei kept journals for all of those years. Here's my favorite journal entry. May 10, 1869, Promontory Point, Utah. Only 100 feet left to lay. That's what I thought of first thing this morning. After several years of hard work, long hours, and little wages, 100 feet of track is all there is left to complete the Transcontinental Railroad today. Now, it is hard to believe the work is complete. Despite the hardship I endured, I feel proud of my work. I think everyone today wanted to share in that sentiment. Wherever I looked, people tried to lend a hand in finishing the track. Men that were just passing through Utah to deliver goods stopped to throw dirt on the ties, or to drive a spike into the ground. Even the presidents of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad took turns driving the last spike into the rails. It was a spike made of gold to mark the special occasion. They both missed on their first try, and all of us workers laughed. It's not as easy as we made it look. In fact, it was very difficult. Day in and day out, we swung those heavy hammers, driving the sharp spikes that held the wooden ties together into the solid ground. We carried heavy wooden ties in the hottest weather you can imagine. The worst days, by far, were those spent drilling tunnels into the Sierra Nevada mountains. These tunnels had to be big enough for locomotive trains to pass through. First, the stone had to be blasted with dynamite. Then we went in and worked on shaping the tunnel. No matter how hard we worked to cut into the stone, we would only move a few inches a day. I can still remember how tired my arms felt at the end of those days. It seemed like there was no end in sight, and we'd never reach the other side of the mountains. Other days were filled with worry as we worked through land where Indian tribes were still powerful. They did not like us building through land that had been their home for many hundreds of years. I do not know how the railroad would change life for them. For settlers and their families on the West Coast, I think the Transcontinental Railroad will change lives a great deal. Trains will provide a faster and cheaper method of transportation for goods and foodstuffs. People on the East Coast will now be able to get goods from the West, and people in the West can now get goods from the East more easily. Travel for people who can afford the train will be more comfortable and convenient too. Of course, many people who cannot afford train tickets will still have to use their wagons for travel. As for us workers, we felt as much excitement as we did fatigue. We set the record for laying the most miles of track in one day. On that day, we worked from sunrise to sunset and laid 10 miles of track. Today, we finally finished our work. We've built a railroad that connects the east and west coasts of the United States. One day, people will talk about all of the businessmen who dreamed of this and started the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies. I hope they talk about my fellow workers and me too, the men who built the railroad. Let's take a look at our timeline. In the last read aloud, we added the Pony Express. Let's take a look at this picture. Today we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a photograph of a reproduction of the number 119, one of the two steam locomotives that met at Promontory Summit during the Golden Spike ceremony. The Golden Spike was driven in 1869 to mark the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. This took place about 10 years after the Pony Express venture. Where should we put this on our timeline? We will put this picture of the locomotive right here on our timeline, about 10 years after the Pony Express. Here are some discussion questions. Feel free to pause the video in order to allow time to think and discuss. What is the main topic of the read aloud? What was the first transcontinental railroad in the United States? Before the Transcontinental Railroad, how did people travel to the west? Why did people decide to build a transcontinental railroad? What was the nickname for the locomotive train? Why was the locomotive called the Iron Horse? In what ways are the steamboats and the locomotive train similar? What were some of the hardships that workers faced in building the Transcontinental Railroad? What changes did the Transcontinental Railroad bring? Why do you think the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad were forced to join their tracks rather than be allowed to build their own separate transcontinental railroads?